Hi, my name is Ashley Quick, and I'm with the Project Success Resource Center. Today we're going to talk about no-motive communication and explain it just a little bit. First, I'll tell you just a bit about the Indiana Resource Network and Project Success itself. Then we'll talk about communication being more than just language and the evolution of understanding communication and who has access to communication. Finally, we'll look at, okay, now what? I've given you all this information, what are you going to do with it now? And wrapping up with some additional resources and next steps. The Indiana Resource Network is a collection of resource centers in Indiana that provides services and supports to teachers and administrators of students with disabilities. Project Success is just one of those resource centers, but you can see the icons here on the screen represent many different resource centers that are available to you, many at no cost, to provide services and supports for you and your staff when working with students with disabilities. Specifically, Project Success focuses on supporting students and teachers of students with more significant intellectual disabilities. We do that by traveling around the state. We work with individual districts on site. We'll do regional trainings around the state, as well as the webinars that you see here and additional webinars we've done before. You'll see here our website is projectsuccessindiana.com, and pretty much any of the resources you'll need to access from us will be in that top right-hand corner under Resources, including the recording of this webinar today, as well as follow-up information. Our webinars are all located in the lower left-hand corner of the screen when you click on Resources. So let's get into it. Communication. It's more than just language. This quote here is from the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary and himself is an AAC user. Every person, regardless of the severity of his or her disabilities, has the right to communicate with others, express everyday preferences, and exercise at least some control over his or her daily life. Each individual, therefore, should be given the chance, training, technology, respect, and encouragement to do so. That quote will really frame much of what we talk about here in the rest of this presentation. So what is communication? It's not just language. By and large, it's a purposeful activity. We're exchanging information between ourselves and other people. And that information oftentimes should be carrying meaning. We're doing that across space and across time. We're doing it naturally. We're doing it with technology, whichever is available or preferred. What's important to know is not being able to speak is not the same thing as not having anything to say. And so we'll talk more today about those who aren't able to speak, finding ways for them to be able to still communicate and convey their information and their meaning in ways that are not traditional speech. These are just a few ways that we communicate our meaning and our intentions to others. We can communicate through body language. You see me now using some body language, gestures, pointing to things, sign languages, both American Sign Language and potentially other sign languages as well. Finger spelling, literally using your finger to make the letters in the air. Single meaning pictures, so just a symbol that indicates the meaning of something. An alphabet system of some kind could be in our language or another language. Multiple meaning pictures, this one's really interesting. So perhaps a student communicates using pictures that have multiple meanings. For instance, a frog could mean, could indicate green. They could point to the picture of the frog and mean green. They could point to the picture of the frog and mean frog. They could point to the picture of the frog and mean jump. Frog can indicate many different things depending on what that student is trying to convey and the context around that. So that's a really interesting one to think about. And then finally, the last common method we'll talk about is core and fringe vocabulary. Now, core and fringe vocabulary, that is a little more advanced when we're thinking about students who don't have an identified mode of communication yet, but I did want to share some of that information with you, so we'll talk about that near the end. Why do we communicate? Reasons for communicating. There are many things you might want to convey. For instance, you might want to ask for an item or an activity. A student may be requesting an item or an activity. Requesting comfort. You don't feel great and you need something that will make you feel better. Asking for information so you understand what's going on. Protesting or indicating something is unwanted. That's a big one. Greeting someone, sharing an interest with someone else, or even expressing your feelings. All of these things are what we would like to communicate, and those of us who do not have an identified mode of communication yet still deserve ways to express those things. And so we're going to talk more about what that might look like. Communicative competence, there's a tongue twister, is really important because there are several different varieties or versions of this. But primarily it's thinking about the individual having the ability to freely express their ideas. They have competence, they have the ability, they have these ideas and thoughts within them. And we want them to be able to freely express them, whatever that means for that student or that person. And then two, when we're thinking about communicative competence, it's providing a means for that student or that person to achieve various goals, whether it's personal, educational, vocational, or social. So there are 5 individual communication competencies. These that are listed here are primarily referring to the use of AAC devices, augmentative and alternative communication, but we can think about using them or considering them just with communication in general. So having a linguistic competence means that you have knowledge of and the ability to use the language that you're familiar with, that you're surrounded with, either in spoken language or in written language. Operational competence, that's more so talking about skills of the technical operation of either the AAC system or just how the language works in general. Strategic competence, so understanding the features of the device when you're thinking about the AAC device to be able to use those features to convey a message efficiently. Social competence, this is a big one. Understanding and knowing who you're talking to, what you're talking about, where you're talking, when you're doing it, when's the right time to say the right thing. And then finally, psychosocial competence is being able to handle the demands of everyday life and still be able to communicate what it is that you're trying to convey to people. That's a big skill, that's a big competence that we can help our students develop. Here, I just wanted to share a bit of the guidance from the Indiana Department of Education on their belief about students and having a mode of communication. So, as soon as a student is enrolled, teachers, staff working with that student should be working to identify a mode of communication. If you try various things, various technologies, devices, and so forth, and it appears that the student is not yet demonstrating a mode of communication that is efficient and effective for them, keep in mind all behavior is communication. So whatever behaviors you see that student demonstrating, they are trying to indicate something to you. So start paying attention to that and investigating what the meaning behind those behaviors might be. And then we'll talk a little bit here, but there's a lot more information out there about how can you develop those behaviors, shape those behaviors, encourage those behaviors, and connect them to having a more communicative intent. Best practice would indicate that students should enter kindergarten with a communication system that allows them to demonstrate an understanding of academic concepts prior to entering the 3rd grade. So here's what that means. Best practice is that a student has an identified mode of communication by kindergarten, such that by the 3rd grade, they can use that mode of communication to convey back and forth meaning and what they believe and what they know about academic concepts. If they're not able to do that before 3rd grade, that's okay, but we want to have some kind of system in place that they're starting to work toward that. Only when communication is recognized and consistently reinforced will those with severe physical, sensory motor, communicative, and developmental differences find the effort to communicate worthwhile. This is critical when thinking about our students who haven't yet identified a mode of communication. They still have things that they want to say, that they want to convey to us. So we have to be on the lookout and be very intentional about paying attention to any kind of movement, behavior, signal, potential communication that they're trying to bring forth, because if we're not consistently recognizing those and reinforcing those efforts, eventually, and it won't take too long, the student will just give up. No one is recognizing that I'm trying to say something, that I'm trying to communicate or convey something, and they'll just give up. It's too much effort. So it's critical that teachers and the staff around a student with no identified mode of communication are really paying close attention to anything that may be an attempt at communicating. Let's talk a little bit now about language. So we talked about communication is more than language, but language, of course, is a part of that. And so let's think a little bit about what it means to understand language. First of all, we know that language develops by experiencing the world. If you think about individuals with typically developing language, they are experiencing their world through sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. and the people around them are providing language that associates and correlates with those experiences. That's how we develop language. The same is true for our students with no identified mode of communication. We can still be working on developing language in them. Typically, we understand many words, the meaning of many words, before we're ever able to say any of them ourselves. So it's important that we are still developing and building up that language, supporting that language with our students, because they may be understanding much more than they're actually able to express outwardly. So to develop that understanding and support that understanding of language in our students, this is a list here of some ways that you can do that. Providing opportunities to hear the same words associated with the same situations over and over again. That repetition is key for students to understand the connection between words, between the language, and the actions or the events that happen as a result. Be face-to-face when speaking with your student. If a student is having difficulty developing their language or understanding language, it is critical that we are speaking to them face-to-face and not from the side or from a place where they can't see us. Seeing those motions, that movement in our face, is an important piece of that. Using gestures, objects, or pictures with your words. So if you're telling a student to sit down, pat a chair, associate that movement or that object with the student's direction of sit down. Name what your student is doing or interested in. So if your student is painting, say, Sarah is painting. Tell them what they're doing. Associate the words and the language with the actions that they're taking. It is important to speak slowly and clearly, using a few consistent words. When students are developing their language, it doesn't help to bombard them with a flood of many, many words. Using a few consistent words will help them understand and further develop the understanding of those words. Emphasize the important words. It looks like you want a book. You want book? Emphasize the important words in that sentence were want book. That essentially conveys everything that we need to know. Emphasize those words. Name what it is in the environment. So for instance, if a bus drives by and the student is sort of watching that bus go by, bus, I see the bus go by. Naming, narrating a student's experiences helps surround them with that language that will ultimately help them develop it in the future. So when we're working on students understanding language by providing them these opportunities that I just talked about, we also want to make sure that we're supporting communication through language. So once a student has developed a bit of language, we want to make sure that we're still supporting them in using that language. The most important thing you can do is give plenty of time to respond, plenty of wait time. Teachers, administrators, we all know about wait time and how important it is, but it's really important to wait almost uncomfortably long. Ask a question once and then wait some more. Because once you ask the question again, thinking that you're just prompting them to, or restating it so that they hear you again, you've started that processing process all over again, and it will take even longer. So ask once and just wait. Copy the student's words and actions. That's pretty influential. So when a student is saying a word or performing an action of some kind, if you're copying that, mirroring that back to them, they see that that has meaning, that they did that action or that they said that word, and they'll start associating meaning with that. Interpret what your student is trying to say. If something falls down and the student says, uh-oh, then you say, again, you narrate to them, ooh, something fell down, fall down. Encourage them to finish your sentence by leaving out the last word. So for instance, we're going to the cafeteria to, and wait for the student to fill in the blank. That will help give them a natural opportunity to practice the word eat. Respond to their attempts to communicate. Comment on what they say. Even if you're not sure what it is they're saying, look for, assign intent to what you believe they're saying and respond accordingly. Offer choices. Do you want blue or red? That, again, provides an opportunity for them to use their language or understand that that's an opportunity to use their language. And then add to what they say to you. So if they say man, oh, tall man, that's a tall man. Add, build on what they say. That's another way to support communication through language. So important to remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. From the moment a baby is born, they hear and respond to the spoken word. We bombard that infant with language for the first 12 to 18 months of their lives. During that time, we do not expect that they will utter a single understandable word. Think about that. For children who typically develop language, they spend a good year to year and a half just soaking in every bit of language and spoken things that are around them, but we don't expect them to be regurgitating that in any way. So for a student who is not yet developing their language, but they're a bit older, they're still going to need that same time and maybe some additional time to be developing that language before we ever expect them to say a word. It takes a lot of time to be soaking in that language, to be developing that understanding, experiencing those experiences, and then be able to express that back out. That's okay. You're not a failure, the student isn't a failure. It takes time to develop that, and it's okay to let that happen. Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of what we have understood about communication and what it means to communicate. So we'll talk about then versus now. What was our understanding in the past, and what do we understand now? This one specifically relates to the use of AAC devices. So in the past, there was this idea that you had to be a good candidate to use an AAC device. So only some people were considered to be able to benefit from an AAC device. But now we know there aren't any prerequisites. Cognitive scores, cognitive abilities, behavioral difficulties, none of this should get in the way of having the chance to engage with and use an AAC device. In the past, low expectations and flawed assumptions were the norm. If you've attended any project success presentations before or seen any of our other webinars, you know we talk a lot about presuming competence and some of the flawed assumptions that we are trying to correct or flip in order to be more useful to students. And that's one of them, is that low expectations doesn't do anybody any good. So now we know high expectations, having that presumed competence, and then that least dangerous assumption, right? Whatever it is that we do educationally for students, we want to make sure that it does the least harm to that student and their ability to function independently when they leave us, when they leave school and become an adult. That's now. That's how we're operating now. We're not going to hold anyone back artificially. In the past, there was sort of the symbol hierarchy that was followed. So first, we need to make sure students understand objects. And then we can move on to photographs because those still represent those objects. And then we can move on to symbols. That's the symbol hierarchy, and that's how we operated in the past. Now we understand that language is arbitrary, right? So we would never, for a student or a child who was typically developing their language, we would never withhold our spoken language or withhold our words until they understood objects, right? And we're not going to do that now with our students who are developing their language. So we just need to have that repeated exposure across really a variety of conditions in order for students to gain that knowledge and that language. In the past, there was a pretty prescribed way that we would say, okay, students are going to start working with their language by requesting or by making a choice. Really, we're not going to start there anymore. We're going to start pretty much everywhere in the middle of all the things. So you can see in this blue bubble here, we're going to begin working on language and continue working on language by modeling what we want our student to eventually be able to do. Typical speaking, typical talking, telling stories and jokes, expressing feelings and opinions, asking a question. There's that deny and refuse again. That's a big one for students. We're just going to be exposing our students to all of the uses of language rather than working with them solely on making a request or making a choice. Let's work with them on all those things and immerse them in all those experiences. In the past, the language that we worked on with students was very activity-based and very concrete based. You can see here some of the symbols. It's all about what you want. You want something, you're going to request something, and then there are concrete items, concrete objects that you may be requesting or wanting. And now, instead of sort of narrowing our choices, we're going to focus on core vocabulary, and we'll talk more about what core vocabulary is in just a minute. But the point here is to say that moving forward, we're not going to narrow our options for our students and the kinds of language that we're going to work with them on. Okay, so now what? Let's look at some strategies, methods, resources, and really just a lot of additional information for you to look into and support your knowledge of increasing communication and understanding students who have no identified mode of communication. First, I want to point out the idea of presumed competence, right? That's where all of this starts. Presuming competence, it's a kind of contract between a teacher and a student that we're going to choose the most optimistic stance possible. That's a new quote I found recently about presumed competence, and I really like it a lot because it involves a bit of trust between the teacher and the student. I trust that this student has some abilities, and the student is going to trust me that I'm going to do everything I can to bring those abilities out, regardless of what difficulties or challenges lie in the way. So it's important to understand or think about, where does this idea of focusing on communication and identifying a mode of communication for students, where does this fit into the whole Every Student Succeeds Act and the federal guidance that we have, as well as these higher expectations that we're having for students moving forward? And this really comes down to, well, the high expectations piece, but more importantly, meaningful access. ESSA and the Dear Colleague letter, they have a big focus on making sure that students have meaningful access to their curriculum, to their environment. It's no longer okay to just provide physical access to a classroom or to a non-disabled peer or something like that. We really want that access to be meaningful, and that's where this work on communication and identifying a mode of communication can be critical, that we're going to make the access that students have more meaningful through that process. A little access goes a long way. You've probably seen this slide before in some of our presentations, but what's so important about working on developing language and communication in our students is that provides them additional access. Once they have that access, they can increase their participation in the curriculum and in the social things that are going on around them, and then eventually they're learning from that participation. But it all starts with access. That's why we're focusing on communication, to be able to increase our students' abilities to have that access. Speaking of access, there's one important thing that students need to be able to access, and that's the assessment, the IEM assessment, the alternate assessment. So I wanted to touch just briefly on what this means as far as our students with no identified mode of communication. The procedure for noting no mode of communication on the IEM assessment will be changing for the upcoming school year, the upcoming administration of that test. There will be specific guidance in the testing administration manual. It's not out yet, but it will be soon, so stay tuned. Look at the assessment page on the IDOE website, and they'll be having additional information on that. Something that is really important to note, though, when you're thinking about really any educational situation or test, but especially on the IEM assessment, refusing to answer should not be considered the same thing as having no observable communication. So a student can refuse to answer, but they may still have the ability to communicate. They're just refusing to do so. If you have a student refusing to take the IEM assessment, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to be marking them as no mode of communication. Those are two very different things. Wanted to point out here, there are many response methods that are allowable and acceptable on the IEM assessment. So a student can orally respond, they can point, they can use eye gaze. You can use the print materials on the IEM assessment to develop response cards or use your own. They can respond in sign language. They can use their switches or their AAC devices. So there's really a variety of ways that students can be responding on the assessment that are completely allowed and appropriate. So don't let those things get in the way of a student being able to participate in the assessment. Briefly, just wanted to talk a little bit about, I've mentioned here and there, AAC, Augmentative and Alternative Communication. What is that? Why is it important? Why do we want to learn more about it? So I threw up some sort of quotes here, some different definitions of what is AAC. And in one research study here, they define it as anything that supports communication when traditional methods are insufficient. So if you have a student who has no identified mode of communication at this point, seems like traditional methods are insufficient, right? So we're going to be using anything and everything we can get our hands on to support communication, and that's considered AAC. Another definition for AAC is a wide range of nonverbal communication methods, from sign language and picture boards to mobile device apps and sophisticated dedicated speech generating devices. So that may be more along the lines of what we typically think of as AAC, some kind of device, some kind of thing that is helping facilitate the communication for the student. And then lastly, the last definition here is communication methods that are used to supplement or replace speech or writing for those with impairments in the production or comprehension of spoken or written language. What I think is important about that definition is that we're talking about supplementing as well as replacing the ability to communicate either via speech or writing. So many students have some mode of communication, but they're able to have that enhanced or augmented by using some AAC. So AAC isn't just for students who have no identified mode of communication. It can also be used sort of as a side supplementary piece to enhance their communication. There's aided and unaided communication when we're thinking about AAC. So unaided AAC is really just, you can take it anywhere because all it needs is your body, right? Any part of your body. So those things would be things like gestures, body language, facial expressions, sign language, and then the aided AAC would be using some kind of tool or device, such as the AAC speech generating devices, or maybe a lower tech device like a PEX board or a static communication board of some kind. Either way, we want to be sure we're providing those methods for students, but important to point out that we can have it both ways, unaided or aided. This is just a little bit of fiction and facts to be thinking about. As a special education teacher or an administrator that works with students who have been identified with a disability, I think we know a lot of things about AAC, and so it's important to take a step back and think about, is what we know accurate, or has it perhaps changed? So this chart just is a nice way of looking at, here are some things that actually aren't true, fiction, and some facts about AAC. So I think the top one is pretty key, that there's this belief that AAC should only be introduced once we've totally given up hope on developing typical language or typical speech. And that's just simply not true. And sort of a corollary to that is, well, if we introduce an AAC device, then the student will, they won't want to work as hard to develop their speech or their language or their mode of communication. That's not true either. We can continue working on speech, on other modes of communication at the same time while we're implementing the use of an AAC device. I think that's about it. I'll let you all read the rest of that, but I think this will be a handy sort of reference if you want to refer back to it when you're thinking about students who are utilizing AAC. Here are just a laundry list of different resources specific to using AAC, finding AAC, finding funding for AAC devices, and just all sorts of things that you may need to know or look into if your students are using AAC devices. So this again would be another resource to hang on to. So now let's talk just a little bit about core vocabulary. The main purpose of this webinar was to discuss students with no identified mode of communication. So it may seem a little strange to be talking about vocabulary, but when we're thinking about developing either mode of communication for students or working on developing language in students, core vocabulary is a great way to support the development of that communication or that language. So we'll look at it in just a little bit of detail, give you a little bit of information, and then if you need some additional support, you're certainly welcome to contact Project Success and we'd be happy to help you with that. So to start off with, let's talk about what is core vocabulary. Sometimes I think there's a misunderstanding that core vocabulary is just those key terms in a subject area, right? In science, it's the vocabulary list that we do for every unit or whatever. But that's not the case. So core vocabulary is actually a specific set of words, pretty small, between 200 and 400 words, that make up 80% of what we read, write, hear, say throughout our day and throughout our lives. It really contains all parts of speech, but it's most likely to be sort of the little odd bits such as pronouns, demonstratives, some verbs in there as well. And I put some examples on here: big, little, give, eat, go, you. Pretty simple words that, in a child that's typically developing language, it's those words that tend to come out first because they have the most power in being able to communicate with other people. Core vocabulary is flexible. This is just one example of why we want to focus on core vocabulary, because it can be flexible. It can be used in so many different settings across situations. So for instance, the word different can mean 5 different things. Different can mean strange. He's acting different. Can mean new. I want a different book. I want a new book. It can mean dissimilar, unequal, subtraction. So just that word different, being able to teach a student that word different, we've given them access to now 5 meanings, right? 5 different ways that they may be using that word. That's just one example of how core vocabulary can be flexible, but you'll see here that there are other ways as well. This is an example of using the word turn. Turn is also a core vocabulary word and can be used across settings. So you'll see here, there's a long list of ways that a student may be able to use that word turn. Turning the page in a book, having it be someone's turn in a game. I want to turn with a toy, for instance, and so forth. So you can see that teaching a student, for instance, the word turn opens up so many more doors than just one with that one word turn. They can use it across settings, across situations. These 3 words, go, like, and not, those are a few of the top words I would suggest teaching a student if you're starting to work on core vocabulary in a more dedicated way, because they can mean so many things and be used to communicate so many different ideas. For instance, go can be used either to refuse something, go, like go away, go. That's all you have to say is go, right? But you can, especially with facial expressions and body language, you'll understand what that student means. Not or like, those can also be used to refuse. Just say nope, not, nope, or not like. Those so few words, right? 1 or 2 words, and we get a very clear message about what's going on with that student. Those words can also be used to be social with people, to obtain something or to get something that a student wants, and to share information. So if a student says like and points to something or looks at something, then we know that they're sharing that information. They're perhaps trying to obtain that object or that activity. There's no more important educational outcome than that of communication for students with significant cognitive disabilities. And of course, now we're referring to cognitive disabilities as intellectual disabilities to align with Article 7. But think about that for a moment. There's no more important educational outcome. Project Success spends a lot of time talking about how we can support students in increasing their access to academics, to academic standards, to general education curriculum. And that is very important, critical. But when it comes right down to it, it all comes down to communication. A student needs to be able to communicate back and forth with a teacher, with a peer, needs to be able to interact with the materials, with the curriculum. Communication is at the heart of all of that. So if we do nothing else with a student with the most significant needs, we need to be working on finding that mode of communication and never give up on that. Here are just a few additional resources that I've tried to collect for you here. So the Indiana Department of Education has a couple of things here. There was a Spread the Word back in September regarding communication. It's really a several-page document that has all sorts of bits of information and different resources and things like that, so I definitely recommend checking that out. I also included on here a link to the review of students with no mode of communication that was done earlier in the summer of 2019. So lastly on this slide, we'll look at the Patents Lending Library. Patents has a wide range of assistive technology devices, different softwares, resources, apps that are available for you to try at no charge. Shipping to you and then returned back to them is at no charge as well. So I definitely recommend clicking on that link if you have a student who you think would benefit from some kind of assistive technology device, or you're not sure if a student would benefit from some kind of device. Reach out to Patents. They're really the experts in that area. They would be more than happy, I know, to support you in that. But clicking on the Lending Library will give you an idea of the kinds of things that are available to you and to your students. Every Move Counts, clicks and chats. This is a great sort of method program that goes back to that idea that I mentioned earlier about we have to be so intentional about paying attention to every move our students make, every facial expression, every body movement, every noise that comes out of them. For our students with the most significant needs, who are really, really impacted by their struggles to have a mode of communication, paying attention to every move that they make is important, and this is sort of a method or a program that will provide you more information on how to do that in a more strategic way. The AAC Language Lab is just full of resources, both about AAC, but also just about language in general and the development of language. And lastly, Project Core is out of UNC Chapel Hill. They do a lot of work specifically focusing on core vocabulary, so that's another great resource if you're interested in that idea of core vocabulary with your students. A couple last things here, resources specific to Project Success. We have some online courses developed for paraprofessionals, and these are paraprofessionals of any sort in special education, not just students working with students who have more significant needs. Right now we have a series of 3 courses available, and there will be 3 additional courses released throughout this school year. They're available at no cost to any educator in Indiana, and there's a link right there that you can enroll in those courses, or you can also go to our website on projectsuccessindiana.com. That should be on the front page of our website in order to enroll in those courses. Project Success has reinstituted their newsletter on a quarterly basis for letting you know about our upcoming trainings, resources that we come across, other articles or good best practice information for supporting students with significant needs. So that link there will take you to the subscription page. And lastly, we have just a couple more webinars coming up planned this year. So this was our second one for the year, but we also have another one coming up in the spring specific to IEP goal writing with content connectors. And most importantly, that fourth one is going to be TBD, to be determined by feedback from the field. So if there's a topic that we haven't yet covered in a webinar, no one else has been covering in a webinar that you're curious about, that you'd like to know more information, please feel free to shoot us an email. Let us know what it is that you'd like to learn more about. So wrapping up here with some next steps that are specific to this webinar, we will have open office hours on Tuesday, December 12th from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you've watched this webinar, still have some questions or it sparked some thoughts in you that you'd like some additional information, visit our website, projectsuccessindiana.com, and you'll be able to register for those open office hours. It's basically a call-in time where Project Success staff members and supporting teachers will be available to answer your questions, provide details on experience with these different topics that we've talked about today. It's just another way to get some additional information and get your questions answered. So I definitely recommend joining us for that. And lastly, as I mentioned, for anything, truly, honestly, we'd like to support you in your work that you do for students with significant needs. Feel free to email us. Our information is here on the screen and also on our website. Thanks so much for joining me today for our No Motive Communication Explained. Any additional questions you have, please feel free to email. Have a great day.